Professor Leslie Thomas QC, former Joint Head of Garden Court Chambers, Gresham Professor of Law, and now a visiting Professor of Law at Goldsmiths, is the preeminent authority in the country in claims against the police, particularly relating to deaths in custody, other public authorities, and corporations. Leslie's impressive career has seen him instructed in some of the UK's most high-profile inquests and inquiries. The New Crossfire Inquest, of particular pertinence to Goldsmiths and our community, the Mark Duggan Inquest, the Hillsborough Inquest, the Birmingham pub bombings inquest, and the Grenfell Public Inquiry, where he is currently representing 23 clients, including survivors, bereaved families, and loved ones. "We can't breathe" was the chilling reminder that Leslie offered when he appeared before the Grenfell Inquiry in July, a sad reminder of the experiences of some of those who perished in the Grenfell tragedy, which had particular resonance with the Black community in the UK, as there is a disproportionate number of Black people who are stopped and searched by the police and who die in police custody, as Leslie's indefatigable work has time and again demonstrated. Such is the strength and pervasiveness of Leslie's work that it intuitively connects some of the darkest episodes in modern UK history when it comes to the duty to protect the right to life, bringing to the surface a common theme of racial inequality that commentators and activists have been documenting for years, and that is still prevalent today, as Leslie's activist legal practice will not let us forget. Leslie has appeared in leading high-profile death in custody cases representing the families of the deceased, Azelle, Rodney, Mark Duggan, Christopher Older, and Sean Rigg. He was awarded Legal Aid Barrister of the Year in 2012 and again in 2016 for his work on the Hillsborough disaster. His appointment as visiting professor in law at Goldsmiths, which we were very privileged to see him accept earlier this year, coincides with his appointment as the first Black professor of law at Gresham College. His inaugural lecture series at Gresham is examining death, the state, and human rights. And as all those fortunate enough to attend them have been able to witness, the lectures have offered a deep, shattering realization of how systematic racial inequality at professional, cultural, and institutional level can crush aspiration, undermine life outcomes, if not take away the inalienable right to life altogether. Professor Thomas's writings and teachings are no stranger to us at Goldsmiths. Our department and college share Leslie's passion for equality and social justice, and we have been extremely fortunate that he has already taught our students in the Department of Law on a number of occasions. But tonight marks Leslie's first public, even virtual, lecture at Goldsmiths, an occasion whose pertinence and timely character we should not fail to underline at a time when vulnerable communities of people are again disproportionately tested in the context of the pandemic, for instance, in comparison to those coming from more privileged backgrounds. It is an occasion that we are celebrating with Leslie, for Leslie at Goldsmiths, as another opportunity to highlight the civic mission of our college, and within that, the ambition of our dynamic Department of Law to shed light on law when it applies as a conservative force, and to do our best to engage with the process of positive change. Leslie, thank you very much for your tireless contributions to Goldsmiths already. We are delighted to have you here and very much looking forward to your lecture with enthusiasm and anticipation.
Thank you so much, Dimitrios, for that warm and most kind introduction. Let me start. So this talk I've entitled, 40 years of policing Black people. I want to start, if I may, with a poem. I ain't welcome here no more. I walk down the street and guess who I meet? The men in blue who are supposed to defend, but instead they chose to apprehend. They slap, punch, choke me red. They won't stop until I end up dead. Oh, stop, please, I can't breathe. I beg of you, just go and leave. My cries all disappear out of sight. I'll end up dead if I try to fight. His knee is up against my throat. No one can stop him. They are all too remote. My God, what country do I call this? A station where the pow pow can just go bliss. At my expense, I kid you not, I'll be beat, stepped on, or even shot. This nonsense must stop. But of course it won't. All I can do is scream, please don't. As I bleed here, lying dead on the floor, I know I ain't welcome here no more. That is a poem written by Ayodele Ayula, a grade 9 student. As Elijah Lawal said in his book, The Clapback, quote, "It's tiring to always have to push back against the notice that we are lesser, to constantly have to justify our existence, our entitlement to basic civil rights, and the need for equality." In the summer of 1958, people of African descent were subjected to a horrendous racially motivated attacks in both Nottingham and in Notting Hill, London. Large groups of several hundred of people gathered in Notting Hill. Windows of houses in which Black people lived were smashed with bricks, bottles, and iron bars. Chants such as "kill the N-word" and "keep Britain white" were heard. There were references to lynching and Little Rock in Arkansas, the USA, was where there had been racial disturbances in 1957 to 59 over the decision on desegregation of schools following the US Supreme Court's ruling in the case of Brown against the Board of Education. There were large groups of teddy boys dressed in Edwardian-style clothing who were engaged in violence. In Nottingham, crowds of up to 4,000 went out, and again, using the N-word hunting. That's an extract from Colin Bob Semple's book, Race, Jail versus Bail, 2012. I think it's important to start with some definitions. I want to be clear about terminology. When I refer to Black, I want you to know I'm not using this term in the 1970s meaning of political blackness, meaning all non-white people who have a common fight against discrimination and thereby embodying African, Caribbean, and Asian peoples and other minorities. Of course, I understand political blackness, and there are times where political blackness has its place. But I feel, firstly, we've moved on from this time, and that is not to say that there isn't a common struggle among minority peoples, or I should say the ethnic majority. But I believe this confuses and clouds the picture, since not all minority groups experience the same problems. Our struggles are different because we are treated differently. Statistics in terms of the treatment of racists bears this out. So I personally prefer to use the term people of African heritage or of African descent. And I mean by that people of predominantly African Caribbean peoples. But Black is very much ingrained in our lexicon, so I might use it, inadvertently. But when I want to refer to the ethnic majority, and I'm talking about the worldwide ethnic majority, not the ethnic majority in this country, I shall use the expression people of colour. As Bob Semple writes in his book, Race, Jail versus Bail, Throughout the British plantation system, it was customary for the planters to become magistrates. They were the people responsible for the constant whipping and other forms of torture of enslaved Africans, in addition to their roles as justices. After emancipation, the planters continued to act as magistrates and dispense justice, sometimes very harshly. I believe it's important for us to understand some of the historical reasons for the differential treatment of people of African descent and why that might continue to this day. In Akala's book, Natives, he states, quote, both black and white children generally understand very early on that blackness is a synonym for bad and whiteness is synonymous with wealth, power, and beauty. For black children in Britain, our bodies commit the sin of reminding people racialized as white of an uncomfortable truth about how this nation became wealthy and that the good old days when white power could roam the earth unchallenged are over. They now have to contend with one of their empire's many legacies, a multi-ethnic mother country. Bob Semple writes, quote, under a paragraph headed Survival of the Fairest, Fryer commented that 19th century sociologists assumed that white skin and Anglo-Saxon civilization were the culmination of the evolutionary process. Fryer, 1984. The power of this theory was such that in 1876, at about the time the Atlantic trafficking in the enslaved Africans was ending, Cesare Lombroso, an Italian prison doctor, who is said to be the founding father of the positive school of criminology, included darker skin and thicker curly hair in his list of physical features of atavism, which he said were displayed by criminals, savages, and apes who were an evolutionary throwback from an earlier age. This was known as criminal anthropology. His views were subjected to critical analysis by various commentators and were considered by Savitz to have coincided with the rise of social Darwinism, which justified racism and inequality on the basis of evolutionary principles. Lombroso's pupils included Thurn and Garofalo, who supported Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy and extended the theory further to the point where Garofalo argued that criminals and their descendants should be eliminated in various ways by death or by long-term life imprisonment and transportation. This theory helped perpetuate the myth of the criminal being ape-like black cannibal swinging from tree to tree as contained in Tarzan comic books. Rudy Narayan, the barrister, the late great Rudy Narayan, referred to this image, which had even appeared in the minds of one or two judges in the Old Bailey. You see, we as a people are often othered, seen as different. Bob Semple gives numerous examples in academic works. Gus, John, and Humphrey, in their works, young black people were referred to, were seen as projecting something as foreign or alien. 1971. Anthony Lester and Jeffrey Beinman referred to a widely publicized lecture delivered in 1969 by Lord Radcliffe, the very same Lord Radcliffe who was responsible for partitioning India, which echoed the theme of the foreign character of Britain's black communities. Examples of what Lord Radcliffe reported to have said included that black communities were the guests of the white host community, and that there were a large alien wedge, that they carried their colour, a flag of strangeness, and all that strangeness implied, and that they were rather colonies of immigrant workers rather than immigrant settlers in the full sense, many of whom would one day return to their homeland. Rudy Narain referred to the image of Black people as being servile, subservient, savages in Africa and slaves in the Caribbean in the minds of many white people. Stuart Hall described the damaging effect of the British media reporting of muggings in America, which resulted in a transmission into Britain of all those troubling themes and images which went along with it, one of which was the fear of sudden robbery by Black youths. That was Stuart Hall in 1978, quoted in Colin Bob Semple's book. You see, it's necessary to appreciate the history of the Black experience, in particular, the African Caribbean resistance over 3 centuries against oppression and brutality by slavers, by the plantocracy, by colonial governors, administrators, magistracy, and the police, who exercise authority and control over them for the benefit of the ruling classes. These ruling classes also lorded over the working classes in England during the 18th and 19th century. Bob Semple. But you see, even in the 2020s, we still have these images of these racist views today. Men of African heritage in their encounters with the police are often described as powerful with superhuman strength, needing several police officers to restrain us. There's something so unique about the Black man that it engenders fear in police officers up and down the country. Let me give you some history. The Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, in which the Black People's Information Centre was located, and where the Mangrove restaurant, a popular venue for Caribbean people, was situated. In 1970, a protest march against police brutality and harassment of Black people took place in Notting Hill. The march led to clashes with the police, charges of incitement to riot, and other charges. An Old Bailey trial of 9 Black defendants, known as the Mangrove 9, ensued. This has been recently shown and serialized in the Small Axe series. The defendants made an application to Judge Edward Clark for a jury of their peers. And my former head of chambers, the late Ian MacDonald, was counsel representing one of the defendants. And he commented about the issues of racial prejudice in society and its relevance to jury selection. This was initially rebuffed by the trial judge. However, it was accepted that there was a discretion invested in the judge to ensure that there was a racially balanced jury. And after several peremptory challenges, the defendants were tried by a jury of 10 whites and 2 Black people. The defendants were acquitted of the charges of incitement to riot after a hotly contested trial. This trial was a cause célèbre in which legal history was made, as Judge Clark confirmed that there was evidence of racial hatred in the Metropolitan Police Force. No, this occurred some 28 years before the Stephen Lawrence inquiry's finding of the existence of institutional racism in the police force and other institutions countrywide. There was an interesting article by Robin Bunce and Paul Field in The Guardian on the 29th of November 2010, where they wrote, quote, Darcus Howe, who worked at the Mangrove, urged Critchlow to look to the community for support. Together with the Black Panther movement, they organised a demonstration. On the 9th of August 1970, 150 protesters marched to local police stations demanding the police get their hands off the Mangrove. Hands off the Mangrove. Police preparation for the march was extensive. More than 700 officers were available. Special branches Black Power Desk was also mobilized to monitor the protests. Heavy-handed policing prompted violence, and the authorities started to build a case against the demonstration's leaders. Home Office documents revealed that there was a deliberate strategy to target and decapitate the emerging Black Power movement. New Crossfire, 1981. Local history appeared to support the theory that that fire was the cause of a racist attack. 10 years before, you see, in 1971, a Caribbean house party had been attacked by a firebomb in Sunderland Road in nearby Forest Hill, leaving 22 people injured. And 3 years after that, in 1978, the Deptford Albany Empire Community Theatre was burnt down, with the National Front claiming responsibility. You see, this was an era of far-right extremism marked by violent racist attacks that Britain prefers to forget. Chanté Joseph, writing a book on British Black Power, stressed the need to remind people that in recent history, white people, this is a quote, white people in this country made bombs and threw them at us, end of quote. There was already a lack of trust among the Black communities in the official response and the general perception of the police as racist and discriminatory. Abuse of the so-called sus laws, for example, which allowed the police not only to stop and search, but actually take people into custody on mere suspicion, was in constant use. Police raids on parties and the accusations of brutality were ever present. In a Guardian article, it was quoted, David Michael, the first Black police officer to serve in Lewisham in the 1970s, New Cross is part of the borough, described the force at the time behaving like an occupying army. Unfortunately, this is the approach many felt the police took to the investigation of New Cross fire. The line of inquiry into the firebombing was quickly dropped in favour of a theory that a fight had broken out and that unruly Black youth had caused their own deaths. A number of survivors were detained for questioning, and activists exposed how children were encouraged to sign false statements. The story of Denise Goodin is recounted by Carol Pierre in Black British History, New Perspectives. At just 11 years old, Denise Goodin was subjected to hours of questioning in the early morning and pressured to admit there had been fighting at the party. Cecil Gutsmore, the academic and activist who was active in the mobilisation after the fire, explained that almost immediately victims became suspects. I personally remember in 1981, me being subjected to policing under the sus laws. It's a story I've told many times before. I'll just briefly outline it here. I was coming home from school. I was about 14, 15. I was in my school uniform and a police van pulls up alongside me. Officer jumps out. Yes, officer, how can I help you? Officer to me, we want to search you. Why is that, officer? You look suspicious. You fit the description of somebody who's been involved in a robbery. In what way do I fit their description? Don't be cheeky, son. I can only assume that the robber must have looked about 14 years old, was wearing a school uniform and had a school blazer on. You see, this is what we were subjected to on a regular basis if you were young, and black. In 1981, you had the riots following the New Cross fire, and that's well documented. And this was in response to what many in the black community considered to be heavy-handed policing. That led to the Scarman report following those riots. We thought perhaps we had seen the end of this, but nearly 15 years after the 1981 riots, in December 1995, there was further unrest. This time in Brixton, southwest London, again triggered by the death in custody of a young black man named Wayne Douglas, and anger at policing in the community. You see, what happened was, in the early hours of the 5th of December, following reports of a break-in and a knife-point burglary of a young couple in bed, Wayne had been pursued by police through the streets of Brixton near the scene of the alleged crime. At about 2:30 a.m, Brixton police officers succeeded in making his arrest, and he was taken to Brixton police station. An hour later, lying in handcuffs, Wayne's heart stopped beating. On arrival at hospital, Wayne, who had previously been in good health, was found to be dead. He was just 25 years old. The following day, Wayne's family had not been contacted. The next night, his sister saw a report that a man had died in Brixton police station. Unable to get in contact with her brother, she rang and asked the custody officer if Wayne was in custody, but was told no straight away. Later, she was told to ring Scotland Yard's press bureau, and at about 4 p.m. on the following day, a police inspector called her, who told her about the robbery and said that the dead man was Wayne. She then went to formally identify her brother's body. She discovered that postmortem had already taken place. It indicated he had died from heart failure due to an underlying condition. But things did not add up. Wayne was young, he was fit, he was healthy. By December 1985, I had been at Garden Court for about 5 years. I was still young in my career when I heard the news about Wayne's death. I was in London, working on a number of police cases and police civil actions, busy doing paperwork, getting on with the usual hectic Christmas holidays at home with 2 young children. But the circumstances surrounding the death of another young black man at the hands of the police and the statements issued by Scotland Yard in the days following were hugely controversial. And once again, riots were sparked in a community where grief was so often coloured with outrage, not only with the police not mounting proper investigations into the death of black people, it seemed they were now killing us. A week after Wayne's death, about 100 family members and friends and members of the local community gathered outside Brixton police station in what started off as a peaceful demonstration and protest at the latest police-related death, which had been just 6 months after yet another brutal killing of Brian Douglas, unrelated to Wayne. Emotions were running high when the protesters began a march down Brixton Road. The anger and frustration mounted, with some chanting "killers, killers" at the police in full riot gear lining the route. The police presence at the demonstration was later described by some present as incredibly heavy-handed. A 2-mile area surrounding the centre of Brixton was sealed off, and the tube stations at Brixton and Stockwell were closed. The standoff between the police and the protesters quickly escalated into violence. Several cars were set on fire and shops were looted. That inquest in December 1996 into Wayne's death was really my first really big case. My second involving a death in custody following restraint by the police. It would be the first of several similar cases I would work on involving Brixton police, and it would be the beginning of a career dealing with restraint-related deaths of particularly Black men involved in the police. In the light of the outcome of a number of recent high-profile inquests and inquiries into the death of Black people in custody, which had been attracting special cause for concern, we knew that Wayne's inquest might be the focus of heightened media attention. Just months earlier, in August 1996, in the same week that the inquest in front of Sir Montague Levine, the Southwark coroner, into the killing of Brian Douglas, who had died after being struck by a long-armed police baton in May 1995, a jury had returned a verdict of death by misadventure. We learned that the Crown Prosecution Service had decided not to pursue any criminal prosecution against any officer in Wayne's death. A month later, in the September of that year, for the first time, the Home Office had published the numbers of deaths in custody of all police forces in England and Wales. And in the year 1995 to 1996, this had provided information retrospectively on the numbers of death over the previous several years. And this report showed that the number of people dying as a result of contact and arrest by the police had risen sharply. 50 deaths in custody were recorded in the years from March 1995 to April 1996. 19 people had died in police stations, 13 of which were in London. The new report shed light on some police complaints and discipline in police forces in England and Wales. And the report showed that 98 officers had been dismissed, 63 had resigned following disciplinary hearings from duties. Charges were brought against 410 officers, 117 of which were as a direct result of the public. But no police officer had been successfully charged or prosecuted with the death of anyone in custody. Quote, the 2003-2004, when compared with the population estimates, Black people were 6.4 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white people, compared to 5.8 times more likely than the previous years. Figures for stop and search by the police showed that per 1,000 of the population, Black people were stopped and searched 7 times more than white people for the 2009-2010 figures, and were arrested 3.3 times more than white people. Ministry of Justice figures, 2010. It also said that the offence covered situations which cannot be dealt with by any other charges and enables police officers to arrest without warrant. You see, Black people were 2 times more likely to be arrested on suspicion of theft. Common examples of suspicious acts of jostling pedestrians in the street, passengers on buses or trains with the intent to pick pockets or steal purses or trying car door handles. An example of evidence normally given by at least 2 police officers is that they observed the suspect walking with his head down, looking into women's handbags, jostling women about to board a bus, undoing flaps of women's bags, but for some reason the suspect was never able to get the purse. And the women described are never produced in court to give evidence. I quote all of this from Colin Bob Semple's book, Bell, Race, Bell versus Jail. And I quote Bob Semple saying, quote, "Those who wish to have the offence of sus abolished argue that the law is antiquated and vague and open to abuse by prejudice and unscrupulous police officers. It is said that this law gives him a legal excuse for harassing and arresting persons who come to his attention by reason of their appearance, e.g., a young group of blacks at a bus stop at Oxford Street near Marble Arch. A prejudiced officer is able to imagine the young black as being a potential mugger and could falsely fabricate evidence by alleging he saw what was merely a figment of his imagination." Unsuccessful attempts to steal, Bob Semple, quoting from his book in 1979. In February 1989, when the author Bob Semple was invited by the MP Linda Hay to prepare and present a paper on black defendants to the magistrates' courts, I quote from Bob, Bob Semple, this is what he said. "What struck me most was how little white magistrates seem to know about black people's culture, customs, and history. That only 20 out of a total of 26,000 magistrates had attended any such course. He was introduced as a black solicitor, but pointed out that the type of solicitor was sufficient. Problems are caused by the attachment of racial tags, labels, and sometimes these tags and labels are based upon misperceptions, misinformation, and misinterpretation." You see, numerous studies have been carried out since the 90s, which show very little has changed since Bob Semple's work. Mark Duggan. Many of my colleagues of African heritage have been treated in an appalling way by the legal system. Two examples come to mind recently. Many of you will have read about Alexandra Wilson and Luke McLean, who were mistaken for defendants or not being the barrister when they were at court. Just think about this. If we as professional people can be treated in this way in a so-called well-respected profession, it takes very little imagination to think how defendants of African heritage are treated by the police. You see, quote, this is a quote from a Guardian article in 2014 by Shadow Justice Minister, as he then was, Sadiq Khan. "Police officers must remember at all times that one badly conducted stop and search can undo years of hard work building community relations. We urgently need to revisit the workings of the all stop and search powers with particular regard to whether the powers are proportionate to the challenges we face." And Sadiq Khan said that shortly after Mark Duggan's death. He also said in the Guardian article, "But there are deeper concerns." He said it was completely unacceptable that more than half of strip searches carried out in London over the past year by police involved black and minority ethnic Londoners. He voiced concerns about the stubbornly white nature of the Met, saying it remained a huge problem that urgently needed to be addressed. He cited figures showing that there was no shortage of potential minority ethnic recruits to the Met. So but with 37% of the applicants in 2012 being African, Caribbean, or Asian, yet only 10% of the officers were from minority ethnic backgrounds. You see, differential treatment of people of colour occurs at all levels in the legal system. Differential and unfavourable treatment in encounters with the police, in decisions whether to charge or not, bail or not, in the way that they are prosecuted, in the way that they are sentenced, in the types of sentence, in the length of the sentence, how they're treated when they get to prison, how they're disciplined in prison, whether they receive parole decisions or not, and so on. But don't take my word for it. Look at the government's own statistics. The 2017 Lammy review analysed the disproportionate treatment of, I'm going to use that word that I don't like, BAME, people in the criminal justice system. Makes depressing reading. Some of the statistics will come as no surprise to anyone who's been following the news, such as the fact that Black people are 6 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police than white people. But it's not just the police who have a race problem. The judiciary has one as well. The same review showed that BAME defendants were 240 times more likely to be given a prison sentence for a drug offence than white defendants. Black people make up 3% of the general population, but make up 12% of prisoners and 21% of children in custody. And note, every one of those Black prisoners, including those Black children, were sent to prison by a judge. Interestingly, the review also found, by contrast, that there is no evidence of racial bias in jury decisions to convict or acquit, suggesting that our judges have a bigger race problem than juries do. Now, I want to move on because time is ticking away, and I want to deal with how we can deal with these problems. There's an interesting work by Peggy McIntosh called The Invisible Knapsack, written in 1988. And I quote from her work. She says this: "I did not see myself as a racist because I was taught to recognize racism only as individual acts of meanness by members of my group, never in invisible systems conferring unsought racial dominance on my group from birth." You see, the concept of institutional racism was coined in 1967 by Carmichael and Hamilton, when they said, quote, "Racism is both overt and covert. It takes 2 closely related forms: individual whites acting against Black individuals and the acts of the total white community against the Black community. We call individual racism and institutional racism. The first consists of overt acts by individuals which causes death, injury, or violent destruction of property. This type can be recorded by television cameras. It can be frequently observed in the process of commission. The second type is less overt, far more subtle and identified in terms of specific individuals committing the acts, but it is no less destructive of human life. The second type originates in the operation of the established and respected forces in society, and thus receives far less public condemnation than the first type. When white terrorists bomb a Black church and kill 5 Black children, that is an act of individual racism, widely deplored by most segments of society. But when in that very same city, Birmingham, Alabama, 500 Black babies die each year because of a lack of proper food, shelter, medical facilities, and thousands more are destroyed and maimed physically, emotionally, intellectually because of conditions of poverty and discrimination in the Black community, that is a function of institutional racism. When a Black family moves into a home in a white neighborhood and is stoned, burned out, and routed out, they are all victims of an overt act of individual racism, which many people will condemn, at least in words. but it is the institutional racism that keeps Black people locked in dilapidated slum tenements, subject to the daily prey of exploitative slumlords, merchants, loan sharks, and discriminatory real estate agents. The society either pretends it does not know of this latter situation, or it is in fact incapable of doing anything meaningful about it. The Stephen Lawrence inquiry, Macpherson, and I want to give a nod to Sir William Macpherson, who died on Sunday, said, unwitting racism can arise because of a lack of understanding, ignorance, or mistaken beliefs. It can arise from well-intentioned but patronizing words or actions. It can arise from the unfamiliarity with behavior or cultural traditions of people or families from minority ethnic communities. It can arise from racist stereotyping of Black people as potential criminals or troublemakers. Often this arises out of an uncritical self-understanding born out of an inflexible police ethos of the traditional way of doing things. Furthermore, such attitudes can thrive in a tightly knit community, so there can be a collective failure to detect and to outlaw this breed of racism. The police canteen can too easily be its breeding ground. Macpherson found, quote, taking all we have heard and read into account, we grapple with the problem. And for the purposes of our inquiry, the concept of institutional racism, which we apply, consists of the collective failure of an organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their color, culture, or ethnic origin. It can be seen or detected in the processes, attitudes, and behaviors which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racist stereotyping which disadvantage minority ethnic people. It persists because of the failure of organizations to openly and adequately recognize the relationship and address its existence caused by policy, example, and leadership. Let me end that quote by saying this. He went on to say, without recognition and action to eliminate such racism, it can prevail as part of the ethos or culture of the organization. It is a corrosive disease. It's sad that just last year, the present commissioner, when asked whether institutional racism exists in the Metropolitan Police, was reticent in her answer. I wrote in a magazine, Council, in July 2020, last year, quote, it's a flawed and outdated view on racism to believe that the racist is an individual who consciously does not like people based on race and is intentionally mean to them. Such a definition is a deflection which protects the system. When our profession recognizes that racism doesn't necessarily come from individuals, doesn't necessarily have to be conscious, doesn't necessarily mean need to be intentional, we will be moving in the right direction. Racial injustice and racism isn't a simple binary question. The racist needn't be simply bad, ignorant, bigoted, prejudiced, or old. The non-racist isn't necessarily a good person, educated, progressive, open-minded, or fair-minded, well-intended, or young. This discussion goes well beyond this. You see, this isn't just a talk about trying to tinker in the background. We have to recognize that as part of policing, there are systems and structures designed to disadvantage marginalized groups. And there is the expectation that those in a dominant group have access, privilege, and opportunity in not the same way that other minority groups are denied. Let me give you some examples. And I think this is something that police forces need to understand and recognise. What is white privilege? Quote, the reality that a white person's whiteness has come and continues to come with an array of benefits and advantages not shared by many people of colour. It doesn't mean that I, as a white person, don't work hard. I do. Or I haven't suffered. I may well have known struggle. But simply I have received help, often unacknowledged assistance, because I am white. That's a quote from John Greenberg. Now, there are many examples of white privilege, but I've devised the following list within a policing context for the purposes of this lecture. Let me give you some examples. You know you have white privilege if you have having a positive relationship with the police generally, your race. Soaking in media blatantly biased, if the media is blatantly biased towards your particular race. If your race can escape violent stereotypes associated with your race. If you can play the colourblind card, we're all colourblind here, wiping the slate clean of centuries of racism. If you're insulated from the daily toll of racism, if you live in ignorance of the dire state of racism today, can you go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that you're not going to be followed or harassed? Can you go shopping in a group of people of your race, pretty well assured that you're not going to be followed or harassed? If you're stopped by a traffic cop, can you be sure that you haven't been singled out because of your race? Can you talk about issues of racism without being seen as, well, you know, you've got self-interest or you're self-seeking? Can you avoid having that talk with your sons or children about being careful of the police because of the colour of their skin? Can you walk into court and not be mistaken for being the defendant's brother, father, sister, clerk, anyone other than the lawyer? Can you drive a nice car and not worry about being pulled over by the police because it's assumed that black people in nice cars have either stolen it or are drug dealers? Or the converse, you decide not to buy a nice car and you decide to buy a beat up model because you've been stopped on too many occasions, and you know being a black man driving a particular type of car will bring attention to yourself. And when you walk down the road, in your skin, you see a woman clutch her bag close to them because they see you. The police have to recognise that it is a predominantly white institution. White members of the police force need to understand that questioning the way things currently are is not necessarily about them as individuals. We're not attacking them, shaming them, or accusing them, or judging them as individuals. And yes, these are normal reactions to be expected, but it's more the recognition that the system and the way it polices black people is unfair, and the police as a profession can improve. Accordingly, questions of good and bad are largely irrelevant. It's a recognition that advantage may well be tied to race, and that it's systemic and it may well be unconscious. Police officers need to forget the guilt and take action. History matters. Bias is implicit and often unconscious. More importantly, it takes great courage to change the system. But we have to remember this: one size does not fit all. Since racism, sexism, heterosexism are not all the same, the advantages associated with them should not be seen as the same. In addition, it's hard to disentangle aspects of unearned advantage that rests on social class, economic class, race, religion, sex, ethnic identity, and other factors. Mackintosh. Let me end with a couple of quotes, because I've come to the end of my time, although I could speak for hours and hours. James Baldwin wrote, "Neither love nor terror makes one blind. Indifference makes one blind." So let me talk about hope. Can we achieve equity and equality among people? It's not going to be easy, but as James Baldwin wrote, those who say it can't be done are usually interrupted by others doing it. Remember, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Again, James Baldwin. Let me end there. I see I've been speaking for nearly an hour.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for such a thought-provoking, inspirational, bold as expected, courageous as ever inaugural talk. We are delighted to have you in the program, as I was previously mentioned, and we are encouraged by your example. I have no doubt that as we speak, many of our students and other members of the local community will be looking up and be inspired by your example and by everything that you've mentioned today, in the sense of finding the courage, the intellectual curiosity and boldness to challenge the authorities, to challenge privilege. It was a key topic of discussion and informed your inaugural lecture. There are a few observations already in the Q&A. I would encourage other participants. We had nearly 100 participants. We are thankful for the interest, but I would strongly encourage everyone come forward with observations, with thoughts, with questions. And we may begin by taking some of them. Already I can see that more are coming through, and so let us start. So Elizabeth, for instance, who is a historian of Black British history, is commenting that she was loving the historical contextual setting, highlighting how important it is to provide that long history of the demonization of Black communities and the Black male more specifically. And I was particularly intrigued. I heard you make this point before about the superhuman nature, for instance, of the Black individual when detained in the police station. And I'm also wondering how that is consistent with racist views on the other hand. So views that are demeaning, dehumanizing on the one hand, and then attributing a superhuman quality at the same time.
You see the superhuman quality that it tends to be attributed to particularly Black African men of African Caribbean descent. It is not a superhuman quality that is a compliment. It's as if we are animals, as if we can be dehumanized. So I've done many of these cases where police officers talk about oh, well, he was so strong. When somebody is slowly having the life squeezed out of them, and they're not being looked at as if they're human. And so, you know, you have police officers restraining individuals under prolonged and excessive restraint, literally squeezing the life out of them and not stopping, not easing off. And it's as if, as I say, they're not looking at a fellow human being. And there are recent examples of that. You know, I mean, say one of the most obvious examples, widely publicized across the world, was the death of George Floyd. You know, the officer who had his knee on his neck did not see him as a human being. And it's as if it comes back to when we were an enslaved people, when we won our emancipation. It's as if white people have fear of us. The black person is somebody to be feared. And you see, and a number of these cases, I see police officers talking in this way, that he didn't feel pain. I'll give you an example. I'll give you a couple of examples, but one that comes to mind was when I did the case of Ibrahim Assay, first man in this country to die following the use of CS spray. Another restraint there, and again you had this image of Ibrahim Assay that we were spraying the CS spray on him and he was just licking it off as if he was drinking it. Had no effect on him. Died. He died. He died because he couldn't breathe. A jury returned a verdict of unlawful killing. But those police officers from East London, oh, it didn't have any effect. He had this superhuman strength. It took all of us to restrain him and hold him down and, yes, kill him.
Thank you, Leslie. A question from another participant, N.S. Thompson, asks whether you might be able to explain the importance of distinguishing people of African descent in this and other discussion, a topic you've touched upon at the beginning, the definitional issue.
Yeah. Can I explain why I make the distinction between people of African descent, African Caribbean people, and other people of color, Asians, for example, which is the next big group in the UK. We're not treated the same. So when you use BAME or people of color, you are skewing the figures. The Lammy figures in 2017 was focusing in talking about Black people being disproportionately represented in terms of the criminal justice system. The figures relating to the stop and search are not figures talking about BAME in general, talking about Black people, and in particular young Black men. And so when you say BAME, unfortunately, because, but don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that other people of color are not disproportionately treated. They are, and the statistics show they are, but the disproportionality is much greater of people of African heritage. So that's the reason why I make the distinction, and that's the reason why I don't use the expression Black in the political blackness sense, meaning all of us who face a common struggle against an oppressive regime. It's important to be specific, because being specific You don't obscure what is really going on. And if you don't obscure what is really going on, then you will be able to address the problems.
Thank you, Leslie. And this disparity has, of course, been clearly illustrated time and again in official statistics, to which, again, you have, of course, drawn upon.
Absolutely. There's a ton of, you know, I'm not asking anybody to take my word for it. Just go and Google the statistics, you know, these stats speak for themselves.
May I open a parenthesis in relation to drawing on the questions that have already been asked and point you in the direction of an article that you published in Council. The title was "We Need to Talk About Race," a midterm report. And what I had particularly found intriguing, you know, original in that piece, in addition, of course, to the enlightening description of what the problem is. But I was particularly intrigued about the way forward and your dual distinction there between things that have to happen in theory, some, you know, the grammar, the theoretical principles that should inform the way in which we need to move forward, and then practical advice too. And I see that you are referring there. I was particularly intrigued by this. You are referring to the question of allies. So what white people need to do, white people that are allies, how Black people should behave towards white people that are deemed to be allies. For instance, you are saying that we should take the focus away from white people. Implementing changes in this respect is an attack on the structural unfairness, the systematic unfairness, the systematic inequality to which you were referring today, and the inherent white privilege within the system. And you're saying that all that is not necessarily, you know, a personal attack. But I'm wondering, I mean, I completely understand and empathize with what you're saying there. I'm just wondering how difficult that distinction is. You know, how challenging it is to achieve that, distinguishing between, you know, individual white people and the fact that we are part of a system that intuitively, necessarily, inherently gives us privileges that other groups do not necessarily enjoy.
You know, it's not an easy approach, because there are going to be situations whereby, you know, you are talking about individuals and individual responses. There's no two ways about that. But I think we need to try to get the police to engage, yeah, and there needs to be a dialogue. I'm long enough in the tooth to know that you can't just go on the attack. Otherwise, you just, you know, you've got to win hearts and minds, as opposed to, you know, just beat somebody over the head and say you're doing this wrong. And can I give you an example of why I say that? There are times when you do need to just beat people over the head with legislation, right, to get them to change their ways. And an obvious example of that was when the first discrimination acts were Anti-Discrimination Acts were brought into this country to outlaw obvious discriminatory behaviour. I think the first discrimination act that we had was in 1965 Act, then we had a 68 Act, and then we had, you know, the 75 Sex Discrimination Act and 76 Race Relations Act. But until we had those acts, white people in this country were discriminating with impunity. So we have when my parents arrived in the UK, it was all right to have signs. Nobody even thought it was problematic to have a sign up saying no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. Can you imagine? You know, when we look back on it, but hey, that was in my lifetime. That was in my lifetime, right? When you had signs like that. So what legislation has done? Legislation has managed to get rid of those overt acts. Where legislation has not been as effective is tackling indirect discrimination. You've had one or two successful cases, but any discrimination lawyer will tell you how difficult indirect discrimination cases are. And secondly, I think the legislation has been very poor in terms of challenging systemic, structural, institutional racism. And which is why I say it's more than just outlawing behavior. I think, you know, there's only so much behavior you can outlaw when you're getting into people's minds, yeah, right? That becomes difficult. You can outlaw behavior to make it very difficult for people to use the N-word and, you know, things like that. But it's the structures. And privilege is so important. You know, I'm a student to all of this, just like many of you who are listening to this are. I'm learning. But when you look at white privilege, and if you're not even aware, you know, as Kendi says in his book, you know, How to Be an Anti-Racist, there needs to be an awareness, because if you're not even aware, I mean, so I did a talk yesterday for the Inner Temple about privilege in how to be an anti-racist in a profession full of privilege, and I drew up a list of privilege, a different list than to tonight's lecture, because tonight's lecture was focusing on police. But when you think about just simple things that people just don't think about, don't even come to them. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I gave some examples this evening in a police context. But, you know, just simple things like, you know, when you're buying bandages, you know, flesh-colored bandages or flesh-colored plasters, not the color of my flesh. You know, it's just simple, small things which reflect on the structures. And if you're not even thinking about it at that level, if you not even aware on that level, it's going to be very, very difficult to tackle these problems.
Thank you, Leslie. The next couple of questions we can take together. One relates to how we can make the police more accountable, and I suspect you know, you would need another 2-hour lecture to deliver on that in detail. But I think we can couple that, we can join that with questions that I suppose emerge from current debates and recent debates in the United States about defunding the police. So taking power away, taking funds away. I suspect there is a tendency to simplify that question and you know, oversimplify, and then the defunding is understood as a tendency to undermine the work of the police, which is obviously not the case. I'm sure you'll agree with that. I understand this as a transition of these funds to other noteworthy, important social values, as opposed to, you know, the police being the only recipient of substantial amounts of money in that direction.
Yeah, I think the really good questions. If I can deal with the defund the police question, I think the question has become toxic and divisive it's been and misunderstood. Your understanding of it is correct. It's my understanding that some people, and I think, in fact, there are some people who think that defund the police means we should, get rid of the police and start again. But that's not, as I understand it, the defund the police movement was meant to be. It was, as you rightly say, Dimitrios, there are parts of the police service which aren't best catered for dealing with public. And can I give you a very specific example? So when you're dealing with people with mental health problems, so to enhance the services of the mental health professionals who are more suited to deal with when somebody's having a crisis. But that doesn't mean get rid of the police. That means target your resources where they can be more effective. Now, I just think that's very sensible, and I'm sure many police forces would believe that's very sensible, in terms of how resources should be used. But as I say, some sections of the media have either misunderstood or intentionally been mischievous in terms of what it means, and this defund the police. And it's been I say it's become toxic because it's been a way of trying to undermine the Black Lives Matter movement, which is unfortunate.
Fabian Higgins, one of our LLB students, one of the leading students in the program, I must note, is with a positive mind, noting that the solution may be for Black British people to involve themselves in law, involve themselves in politics, in policing. Would you agree? I mean, I strongly suspect you will to some extent.
Yeah, I think people need to. I think people need to be aware and educate themselves. But then I think to myself, there are many white communities that don't need to involve themselves in the police. They don't need to do this. And again, that comes down to they have the privilege not to be able to worry about these things, whereas Black people, we don't have that privilege. And wouldn't it be nice for me as a Black man not to be able to say to my Black son, look, you're now of that age, you need to be careful when you go out on the street. You're now of the age where I need to educate you and make you aware of, I would like to have the privilege where my teenage boy, still has years of innocence and not need to worry about issues like that. So I understand the question and I get it. And, you want to make sure that people are properly prepared to deal with the big wide world. But it would be nice if we didn't have to, if there was equity in this.
I completely empathize with this point, and it's important that it's coming strongly through recent literature on white privilege and racial inequality more broadly. Like, the need for the community that is impacted by all of this to not necessarily have the burden of pushing forward in the way that you just described. But I think in terms of Fabian's question, I can also see where that is coming from, because he's got a passion for law as a means to achieve reform and justice. Next question by Gintare, if I pronounce the name correctly. If not, I apologize. But whether you think that the police have been acknowledging racism exists. I mean, you have made a very specific reference towards the end of your presentation, the police commissioner not necessarily coming to grips with the idea that racism is a pervasive force, negative force.
I think not all police forces are equal. There have been some in the policing community that have embraced this message and who are working very hard. There are some that we still need to do a lot of work on. It's like all sections of society. The reality is, Gintare, when you talk about race, it still makes people very uncomfortable. Particularly if they are part of the privileged group. There's a lot of uncomfort, but we just have to face that. We need to deal with our discomfort and get over it and deal with it. And I think many, it's as Akala says in his book Natives, we have a childish approach to race, because it is a childish approach to think. It's a half-baked approach to think that discussions about discrimination and racism, equal you call me the N-word, therefore you are bad. I have a black friend, therefore I am good. or I might have said something inappropriate, but I didn't intend it, and therefore, because I didn't intend it, what I said wasn't racist. Being a racist, right? We can all come out with racist thinking. It's not solely down to somebody who's an individual. Racism can be systemic, it can be a way of thinking, it can be policies, not necessarily the individual. And I think the challenge is to get that across to people that, racism doesn't necessarily mean you are bad.
I'm conscious of time. We have a few more questions and a few minutes left of what has already been such an intellectually stimulating occasion as expected. One of our anonymous participants is drawing attention to COVID, and particularly policing of COVID lockdown legislation, if I can interpret what they're saying there. And again, the disproportionate impact that this has had on Black people, on Black communities, on BAME communities too.
It's going to be, yeah, you're right for pointing that out. It's something that I was following last year. And, we're going to have, the stats are still coming through. And what's going to be really interesting is the early statistics are showing that the police have been coming down really hard on Black people in relation to the enforcement of the COVID regulations. So that in itself is going to take a great deal of unpicking. But I suspect that for similar reasons to the ones that I touched upon in this talk, those decisions have been infected by that sort of systemic thinking and racism.
I mean, the question extends to asking whether you think questions relating to law enforcement, to the enforcement of COVID legislation might be part of the public inquiry that we expect is going to take place at some point. I mean, I personally suspect that is going to happen, but perhaps it will be of secondary importance, perhaps will be of secondary importance in relation to the government's wider duty to protect life and everything that has happened or has not happened in relation to that.
I have no doubt that there will be an analysis of it, because the bottom line is the statistics will come out. The statistics will come out, and if the statistics are stark, there will have to be an accounting for it.
One of our psychology students, again, interesting to highlight that there is a close interaction, continuous interaction with the psychology department, taking cross-cultural view here, is wondering whether there could be bias testing for judges relating to the ethnicity, gender of the accused and victim, prior to handling a specific case, prior to initiating prosecution, prior to taking a case to court?
It's a really interesting idea. I don't know personally of any work in relation to it in the UK, but I think it's a great idea. How obviously we'd need to be guided by the psychologists and the psychiatrists in relation to how that testing would be done. But yeah, it's not something I've applied my mind to, but I'm my ears have pricked up listening to that. Really interesting.
The next 2 points are interconnected. So the first observation relates to law as a system upholding institutional racism in the police. These are the observations about the police, but we could extend that to the judiciary, to the solicitor profession, the barrister profession, points that you have raised with Panas, of course. And the reverse side of that, and then please reflect on both at the same time if you may. The reverse side is an illustration from Lewisham Council, had a black chief executive for a short period recently, we are told. And so the Councillor Alan Hall is making the observation, asking the question. They're asking your view on the importance of the visibility of black leaders. So on the one hand, the need for more representativeness in the legal system to avoid racial inequality, to avoid bias, and on the reverse of that, what the existence of individuals representing the black community, what can that achieve in the visibility of black leaders in particular?
So I think the visibility in the professions is really important, and it's not because of a lack of black talent or people of color talent. The talk I gave yesterday about the legal profession highlighted the way that recruitment is done I think is really problematic, and I think things will begin to change when you see when there are more when you see people of color in positions of authority and responsibility, when it's just normal, when you don't think about it, right? So that time will come, but it's just crawling at the moment. I forgot the other part of the question. Sorry.
No, I think that the second part related to the fact that to the example that we have from Lewisham about the black chief executive and what that kind of representativeness achieves. The importance of the visibility of black leaders.
The importance of the visibility of black leaders is important, but I would say this: you don't want to have a situation where you have one, somebody just right at the top, and then everybody in, immediately below them remains the status quo, and then so an organization say, well, look, we've done all right, we've got a black leader, and so it's just tinkering. There has to be substantive change, I think. Yeah, but that's not to undermine the importance of having people in leadership positions, because it begins to break down myths that black people can't fill these positions.
The penultimate question, I promise, Leslie, we've kept you for more than an hour and a half now. There is a reference to an initiative by Andy Burnham, Mayor of Manchester, an initiative to place police officers in schools across Manchester in relation to racial justice. I don't know if you're familiar with that, with what that is aiming to achieve. It hasn't come to my attention either, I must say. In that case, may I simply, again, by drawing on one of the final questions that I'm seeing here, and the question is about the Lammy review and in the light of what it has recommended, whether we are doing enough to address the racial disparity in sentencing, the criminal justice system, and more broadly to achieve racial equality. I had a similar observation about your key, one of the key areas of your expertise in relation to the Angiolini report that made a number of recommendations back in 2017. And so I was wondering, I was going to ask you about the extent to which we have begun to implement any of these recommendations, or if we have, to what extent, and are we going forward quickly enough? And if we are not, in a time when you would expect serious engagement, I mean, post George Floyd and a certain awakening of the public consciousness, if change is not occurring at the right speed, at the right pace right now, when is it going to happen?
So the answer to the question is, I don't think change is happening faster. I think it's been pitiful, the government's approach to the Lammy review. Lammy, made it absolutely, very little has been done. And in fact, last year in 2020, the government announced another investigation, another inquiry. We've had enough inquiries. We know what the issues are. There's been a ton of inquiries showing time and time again this disproportionate treatment of Black people. We don't need more inquiries. We know. Governments, institutions just need to pull their finger out and get on with implementing some real change. And implementing change, it involves in educating your community, and it involves some legislation, bolstering the legislation, and it involves, winning the hearts and minds of individuals, and a recognition about privilege and systems of privilege.
In making a concluding observation, will you please allow me to note, Leslie, what an inspirational work you are doing more broadly, obviously not just tonight, but in all these occasions in recent months and years, going out of your way, going the extra mile all the time, with passion, with enthusiasm, to educate the public, to connect with the public, to engage with wider audiences. And I suspect in terms of thinking about the way forward, because I know that you're passionate about the way forward, you have a unique capacity to identify what is wrong, but at the same time, you're very keen to point the way forward. And so, will you please allow me to say that what you are doing is model setting in that regard, in pointing the way forward for many of us, in the sense of inviting us to do the little that we can, that each one of us can do from wherever we may be finding ourselves, in connecting with the public, in acknowledging what the problem is, in bringing to the attention of wider audiences the statistics, the concerns that commentators have identified and that legal practitioners are confronted with on a daily basis. So I thank you for your dedicated work, and I will simply repeat again in ending how grateful we are at Goldsmiths for the fact that you are also doing that from a formal position in our Department of Law. We are very privileged that you have accepted that position.
It's a real honor for me to be part of the Goldsmiths team, and it was lovely to receive the invitation, and I thank you again for those really kind words.
The pleasure is all ours, Leslie. Thank you for an excellent, outstanding contribution tonight, an inaugural lecture. May I simply add that despite this being incredibly intellectually stimulating, we will call upon you to offer a second part, this time face to face, when we are able to go back and we'll be delighted. We're very much looking forward to having you at Goldsmiths.
Oh, well, I'm looking forward to that. I can't wait until we get back to some normality.
Indeed. Thank you ever so much, Leslie, and thank you everyone for your attention. We will be publishing the video with Leslie's consent, of course, very shortly. Thank you for your continuous engagement with Goldsmiths, and see you all very soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.